In the last video, we created our first server call and displayed account details in a lightning card, like so. Okay. Now let us take it a step further by displaying a list of accounts. Okay. What we'll do is we'll first show the records as a list of cards. Then we are going to show them as a data table as well, and then create a toggler between card layout and table layout. Okay, you can switch between your view. You can choose to view the list of accounts in a card layout, like a multiple such cards stacked together, or in a data table format, row by row, and then columns across. Okay. All right, so let's go back to our developer console and create a new component. Okay, lightning component, and then um, let me call it accounts. Okay, and also make it app hostable and available for all page types. Okay, submit. Good. And because this has to bring in a list of records, we have to make a server call, so we will need a controller. Right? So let me specify my controller, and let us use the same controller that we used in our last video. It is called account apex controller. Okay, save it. Now let us go to our account apex controller and implement that aura enabled static method, which will return a list of accounts for us. Let us go to file, open account apex controller, and in here we already have a method which takes in an account ID and returns the single account for our account info component. Now let me copy this over and call it get accounts, and then no input, because we're going to return all accounts without any filters at this time, and then remove the filter where clause, and this will return a list of accounts. Right? Okay, save it. So we have our controller method ready. So we need to call get accounts from our new accounts component. All right. So if you have followed the last video, you know that we will need a aura attribute called, let us call it records, which will contain a list of account records. Okay, so the type is going to be a list, like that, and because we're going to pass in a list of accounts, it automatically knows that you would be iterating over a list of accounts. But you can explicitly say account list, like that, an array of accounts. You could use either. Okay, you could explicitly specify that you would be using a an array of accounts, or you could just use a list. It's a list of records. Okay, let's stick with that for now. And then I am gonna also need a controller, right? Which, let us call it fetch accounts. Okay, in here is where we have to make our server call, which will ultimately um, um, get those list of accounts from the Apex controller. Okay, and like we did before, let us delegate this business logic to our helper. So all I will do here is do helper dot fetch accounts, and then pass in component, event, and helper. Okay, and let me go to our helper and create a new helper method and call it fetch accounts, and pass in component, event, helper. Okay, this is where we have to make our server call. Okay, let's get started with that. So what do we have to do first? We have to first declare our method, which is in Apex. How do we do that? Var action, okay, component dot get, right? C dot, I'm invoking a method, so C dot is required. And what is the name of our Apex controller method? It is here. We called it get accounts. Okay, in there, get accounts. Okay, remember that the name of the Apex method has to be different than the name that you give to your controller or helper.js methods. Okay, we call it fetch accounts here, and in the Apex method, we're calling it get accounts. Right? And notice that this particular method does not take any input parameters. So you do not need to set the parameters for our action. So action.setParams, like how we did before for our account info component, is not necessary because there are no inputs whatsoever. Okay, so I could skip that part and directly go back to my set callback. Okay, you directly go to our set callback, and for this method, after this method executes, do this. Okay, that is what this means. Okay, and first we will have to get the state response.getState and assign that to a JavaScript variable. Let's call it state. And if state is success, like that, okay, then we're gonna get response dot get return um, return value. Okay, and we will assign that to a JavaScript variable called result. Okay, so what is happening? We're calling get accounts Apex method, which is defined here in our Apex controller. It returns a list of accounts, and we would get that value using response.getReturnValue method. We're capturing that into a result. Okay, and now let's see if we have defined. Yep, we have defined a an attribute called records, which is gonna take a list. Okay, so I'm gonna go here and then just say component dot set v dot records with what? With our result. Okay. So at this point, you know that the records attribute on your markup will contain the result returned by the Apex, the server. Okay. Else, let me just throw in an alert for now. Alert with the state. Okay. And then, oh, do not forget to enqueue the action. $a dot enqueue action and your action variable. Okay, save it. So now you have fetch accounts method, which makes a server call ready and populating your list of accounts and capturing it in the records attribute on your markup, in your component. Right, but now we are not invoking this method, the fetch accounts method anyway. So for that, we talked about specifying an init system handler, which is going to be auto handler. Name is going to be init. This has to be init. This cannot be anything else because this is a standard out-of-the-box system provided event. You have to call it event, and then you have to pass in value. You have to pass in this, which means you're passing in this component. So initialize this component with your action that you have specified in your controller JS called c dot fetch accounts, right? Um, and now when you implement this, you have your values populated in the records attribute on load. Okay, now it is going to be a list of records, right? So in order to iterate over a list of records, um, there is a tag called aura iteration. Okay, um, and it accepts items and a variable for each um, iteration. Okay, and for items, what are we going to pass in? We're going to pass in v dot records. Okay, and let us call it a record, the local variable. Okay, and in here you can now specify show me record dot name. You don't have to specify v dot because you're within the context of an aura iteration and you're already declaring a local variable called record. Okay, this is a local variable, this is not an attribute. So you're free to just specify record.name and you don't have to do v.record.name. Okay, so let me save it. And let me quickly spin up a Lightning application to house this new accounts component so we can test it. Okay, Lightning application, accounts app. Okay, submit. And in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to include c dot accounts like that and save it. Preview. There. So notice that in a not so elegant fashion, we have all the names of the accounts that we have in the system currently. Okay, let's style this a little better now. Let's go back to our accounts component there. So in an aura iteration, we are just displaying the name of the record like so. Okay, but remember that we already have a lightning card that takes in a record ID or an actual account and displays this information in a nicely formatted way. We already have that. So what we can do is you can nest that particular component within our iteration. So you're putting a component within a component. Okay, so let me remove that and just specify c dot account info. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is notice that there is this attribute in our account info component called record. Okay, so when you specify an attribute for a particular component and you're using that component as a child component in a different component, you can specify uh, that particular attribute as an attribute from this line directly. Um, so I'm going to say record would be record like that. So this record means that you have an attribute in your account info component called record. Okay, and this is the local variable, the value that we have assigned here. Okay, instead of record, let me just call it rec, and there. So we're passing in the rec to the record attribute that is present inside the component account info. Okay, and now save it and watch what happens when we refresh. Okay, two things happen. One, there is an error, and then there is the styling is somewhat off. Okay, let us fix the styling first. The reason why the styling is messed up is because the accounts app does not by default inherit the Salesforce's native styling system. You have to explicitly specify it. And the way you do that is by saying go to that app, and then in here use extends equals force SLDS. Okay, first, force SLDS. This is only available if you are using an Aura application. Don't use this if you're using an Aura component, because components automatically inherit SLDS, and SLDS stands for Salesforce Lightning Design System. Okay, um, which is CSS, which is just styling of various elements in Lightning components. Okay, so if you're looking at an Aura application, you have the luxury of extending force SLDS, so all the styling is inherited. Okay, let me save it and refresh, and it automatically, now notice that our Lightning cards are automatically um, showing in a nicely formatted way. Okay, now let us take care of the error. Okay, let me say okay. Oh, and notice that this error is showing up twice, thrice, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So looks like we have about 13 accounts in here, I think, and there's an error for each of the lightning card that we have. So there's something going on within the scope of each lightning card. So that would be occurring in our account info component, because this is the one that is repeating multiple times within an Aura iteration, right? So if you go to the controller, if you did go through the last video, you know that what we're doing is in an init on load of this component, we're calling fetch account info, which delegates to helper.fetch account info, and that calls a server method based on the record ID in context. But there is no record ID in this particular situation, because you're not within the context of record detail, right? You're looking at a list of components and you created your own app to test your component, but you're not looking at a particular account. Okay, so that is the reason why it is failing. So in order to stop that, what we could do is go to our controller, and instead of directly calling fetch account info, what we can do here is get the implicitly declared v.record id, okay, and store it in a variable called, let's call it record id. Okay, and execute the helper method only if record ID exists. This will work because record ID only exists if you are looking at this component in the context of a record detail. Okay, if you're not looking at it in the context of a record detail, which is our list of accounts like so, then record ID will be blank. Okay, because hash record ID will only work within the context of a record detail. Okay, so you only invoke it if record ID exists. Otherwise, you're gonna use the record attribute that is passed in from the parent component. So we have accounts, which is a parent component, and that is iterating over a list of accounts. And in the iteration, you specified the account info component, and you're passing in manually the entire record. So you don't have a need to query the account again. The entire record is stored in that rec variable. Okay, so let me go back. So only execute this account info if record ID exists. Okay, this is also bulkified now, so you're not if you have like 1,000 accounts, you're not querying for account information for each component. So this is technically you're bulkifying it. So let me go here and refresh it, and there, no error. Okay, good. Um, and now what I would like to do here is um, notice that the lightning card is spanning across the entire width, right? So in order to make it look a little nicer and responsive, device friendly, what we can do is we can align these cards such that they wrap around um, when for appropriate devices. Let me show you how. For that, there is something called as let me go back to Lightning Component Library. And there's something called as lightning layout. Okay, there's a lightning layout, and within the lightning layout there's going to be a lightning layout item, just like how in Visual Force you have a page block and a page block section. This is a layout would have lightning layout items embedded within it. Okay, let me look at lightning layout item, and let me show you a layout with different size specified for all devices. Okay, so this is how it's gonna look. Our each card is you're gonna have like 4 cards per row, and automatically the 5th card will wrap around into the next line based on the device that you're looking at. And how do you specify that? There is an attribute called small device size, which is analogous to like if you're viewing this component from a phone, how many parts should it occupy? And the number of parts is 12. If the number of parts is 12 in a small device, take 6 parts for this piece. That's what that means. Okay, and for a medium device like a tablet, only occupy 4 parts, so it's more squeezed. And in a large device, show only 3. So if you're viewing this particular component from a phone, you would see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like that, 2 per row. Okay, because it's a 50-50 split. Take only 6 parts out of 12 for this component. If you're looking at a tablet, which is a medium-sized device, you would want to take 4 parts out of 12. So you'd see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, 3 parts, 3 components per row. And in a large device, because you're taking 3 parts out of 12 to display the component, you're going to have exactly this layout because I'm looking at it from a desktop. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So each component is going to take 3 parts out of 12. So you'll see 4 such components, and then automatically the 5th component will wrap around to the next line. It is responsive. It's a very good way of defining your layouts. Okay, let's use this. So I'm gonna go back to our developer console, and in accounts, instead of showing the account directly in an iteration like that, what I'm gonna do is wrap this around in lightning layout. So let me type in lightning layout. Okay, and this accepts another attribute called multiple rows, and I want to set that to true. Okay. Okay, what this does is it allows for wrapping around. If you set this to false, all of the records will show in exactly one line. They will never wrap around to the next line. You don't want to show your records in multiple rows. You want to show them only in one row. That's what it means if you set that to false. But in this case, we want them to wrap around and go to the next line as well. So multiple rows is true, and in here I'll specify a lightning layout item. like that. And size is gonna be 12. Okay. And for a small device size, it is going to be 12 again. So I'll take the entire row. If you're looking at this particular component from a phone, I want the entire first row to be one card. Okay. And then medium device size, it is going to be, say, 3. And then large device size, I'll say also 3. I'm not distinguishing between um, a medium device size and a large device size. Okay. And padding, there's also a way to specify padding around these lightning layout items, and you can say around small, like that. Okay. All right. So we have one lightning layout, and then we need to have multiple such layout items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this guy and paste it within the scope of our iteration. Okay, and put our child component within the lightning layout item, like so. Okay, let me remove the gaps and then do a Control A, Shift Tab. Oops, Control C, Shift Tab, and that will automatically format your code for you. Okay, so oh, and lightning layout. Let me cut that and put the lightning layout also outside around the iteration, like that. Okay. All right. So let's now go back to our component, our application, and refresh the page. There. We have, because we're looking at a large device, I'm looking at a desktop, 1, 2, 3, 4. Each component is set to take 3 parts out of a possible 12 parts. So 12 over 3, it's 4 components, and the 5th component will wrap around automatically for you. Okay, that's the power of a responsive design that Lightning Layout has to offer to you. Okay, what I'm going to do now is remember our objective. We want to create a card layout, which we just did, and we also want to now create a table component, the same data displayed in a table layout, and then eventually we're going to have a toggle, a button, which you can click to toggle between a card layout and a table layout. Okay, so I'm gonna make a design choice here. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a new component and call it account cards, and strictly limit that component for displaying a card layout. Okay, let me show you what I mean. Let's create a new Lightning component, account cards. Okay, and I'm gonna not gonna implement the force app hostable and available for all page types, because it's going to be a child component. It will never have a standalone existence of its own. It's always going to be embedded within the accounts component. So I'm going to submit. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our accounts component and um, take this layout, cut, okay, completely remove it, and paste it here. Okay, so this is going to display a list of accounts, and v.records is not available here, so let me go ahead and grab that, copy, and paste it here. Okay, and let me just save it. Okay, what did we just do? We took away the UI aspect from our accounts component, which is going to display the list of accounts in a card format, in a card layout, and we put together that in a new account cards component. Okay, um, and And notice that it accepts, and we have specified a records attribute within this component as well, and let us make it required. Okay, required is true, and if you have specified required for a particular attribute, you are forced to specify a default value as well, and in this case let me just set it to blank. Okay, so this records component is required for this component to work. Okay, let me just save it. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our accounts component, and here I'm going to say, instead of our there's no display element now. We completely removed the lightning layout which contained the account info, so I'm gonna do c dot account cards, which is our new component that we create for UI purposes, and I'm gonna pass in the records attribute and pass in the records that we have here. Okay, v dot records. Okay, makes sense. So we are passing in records with the records value that we already have at the accounts parent component. So you're still going to execute the onload method, the fetch accounts, that is still happening in the parent account, in the parent component. And what that does is it goes to your Apex server side, gets the list of records and assigns it to the records, and then you have embedded a child component and you're passing in the records to that component, and this code now looks cleaner. Okay, so you're managing your account card layout separately in a different component. So let me just save it and refresh it. No changes whatsoever, right? Nothing has changed, because all you did is you took that piece of code away, put it in a different component, and included that same component back here. Okay, and why did we choose to do that? First of all, it's a design decision. I'm choosing to do it that way because I know the next thing that we're going to do is create a component like account cards, call it account table, and create accept the list of records and display it in a table format. Okay, so the actual processing is still happening in the parent component, but the display aspect is being delegated to a separate child component. That's it. Okay, so let's do that. Let me go ahead and create a new Lightning component and call it account table. Okay. All right. So in here, it is also going to need the records, list of records as an attribute. So I'm going to copy that from our account cards component and I'm going to paste it here. Okay. And for displaying a list of records in a data table format, Lightning offers something called as Lightning data table. Okay, click on that. There. And there are multiple variants to the Lightning data table. I'm going to pick the basic data table for now. Okay, I'm going to pick that. Copy that and go back to our component and paste it. Okay, there. So Lightning data table key field is going to be the identifier, which has to be in the proper case. ID, capital I, lowercase d. The identifier is more often than not, it is going to be ID. Okay, it's a required field. And for data, we need to pass in the list of records. And in our case, it is not v.data, it is called v.records, right? So let me replace that. So our data is going to be passed in with our list of records that we are going to eventually pass in from our parent component, which is accounts. Okay, and for columns, which are the columns that you want to include in your data table component? This accepts a list of JSON objects, and the way they are handling it here in this example is via the controller. Notice that there is an init method which is calling c.init, and that is a controller JS method. In that init, they're setting the columns to these, like so. So notice that this is a list, and each row is a JSON object. Okay, with a label, the actual field name that is present in your records list of records, and what type it is. Okay, let's specify that. And then hide checkbox column. By default, data table component throws in a checkbox as the first column. By specifying hide checkbox column is true, you're hiding that checkbox column completely. No big deal here. But now the pending item that we have to do here is specify the columns. Okay, so for that, I'm going to specify an attribute. Instead of doing it from init, I'm going to hard code it right here. Okay, auto attribute name is going to be columns. Okay, and the type, like I mentioned before, this accepts a list. Okay, and the default value is going to be a list of JSON objects, right? So I'm gonna do a list like that. Okay, and then let us include a label. Label is let us first include a name. Okay, and then the field name for that column is gonna be name again. Okay, and the type is gonna be what? Text. Okay, now let me copy this guy and paste it a couple times, and then a website, right? And then industry, type, and phone. And the field name is also going to be phone. The type is going to be the type, industry, and website. Okay, for now I'm leaving all of these types of each of the columns as text, but if you have a number field or a currency, just make sure you define it appropriately. Okay, for now this will suffice. Okay, and I'm going to save it, and v.columns, we have named our attribute also columns, so this is going to work. Okay, so we have our component with the data table ready here, and we can test it now. But before that, notice that there is no controller or helper methods here. I want you to understand why. Because this component does not have a standalone existence. It will only work based on the records that you pass in as an input. It's going to be a list of accounts in this case. Notice that we have marked it as required, and this will only work as a child component. Our parent component is doing most of the heavy lifting by querying the server and getting the records ready. And once you have those records ready, it's going to be passed to the child component, and we're just rendering the UI aspect in these child components. Okay, so there's no need for us to include a controller and a helper at this level. Okay, so now let me go to our accounts, and let me comment out our um, account cards component, and let me define our new account table component and do the same, pass in records, okay, as v dot records. Save it and refresh. There, the same list of records in a data table. Okay, good. All right, so for our next aspect, all we need to do is we need to implement a toggler button, so the user could click on it to toggle between a card layout versus a our data table layout. Okay, and for that, Lightning has something called as radio group. Okay, it is basically a group of radio buttons, right? And there is a variant of a radio group called radio group with button type, okay, like that. So let us use that and implement our toggle functionality. Okay, let me go here and steal what they have to offer and go back to our accounts component. So this is where we implement the toggler, okay, in the parent component. Um, so I usually put all the attributes together and all the event handlers together. So let me do some code organizing here. Um, Attribute are all together and handler, and then after handler, let me put our radio group base component, okay, like so. And then let's do a Command A or Control A and Shift Tab to format your entire piece of code. Okay, so w- let's look at the Lightning Radio Group base component. A name is just a reference, and then label is the text that shows above the um, uh, Lightning the button group. Okay, let me call it select a layout. Okay, and for options, notice that we're using a v dot options, and the options is specified again as a list of JSON objects. Okay, options is there and it is hard coded. The default value is sales and then force in this case. So let me rename this, call it display options for no reason, for better readability. And then the label is going to be, instead of sales and force, I'm going to call it cards, and the value returned will also be cards, and table, and the value returned will also be table. So the two parameters here, label and value. Label is the one that is displayed in the radio button, and value is what is actually returned when you click on that particular option. Okay, so you can choose to show a name and return its ID if you want to. Okay, but in this case, it's just a string value which is hard coded, so I'm choosing to keep them same, but they could technically be different. Okay, so cards and table layout, and then there is also a value attribute that's been created, which captures the selected value. So let me rename that value as selected display option. Okay, it's of type string, and the default, let us show cards by default. Okay, and this is needs to be replaced with that. Okay, so the value by default is going to be selected display option. Okay, and the type is going to be a button type, so the radio buttons are going to be displayed like a button group. Okay, save it and go back to our component and refresh it. Okay. Oh, because I did not replace the display options like that. Okay, now let's go ahead and refresh. There. So you have cards, and then you have a table. All right. Let me put a break here. Now, notice that nothing happens when you toggle between the two options, because we don't have any on change handler specified, right? For that, radio group Lightning component provides something called on change, and upon change, what should happen? You call handle change controller JS method. Okay, this is what I'm choosing to call it for now, but this could be any name. You could call it toggle radio button method. Okay, but on change, how do I know this? The component library actually offers, in addition to the examples and the variants, it also offers documentation and specifications. So everything that this particular base component handles or accepts is documented here. So I know that there is an on change action event that this lightning radio group base component supports, which is what I'm going to use in my component. Okay, and now I need to implement the handle change method. So I'm going to go to my controller, do a comma to have multiple such methods in your controller JS, and then handle change, right? Function, and I would accept component, event, and helper. Okay, and if you remember um, in the video where we discussed a hello X component, I mentioned the reason, the purpose of component, event, and helper. And then I mentioned that the purpose of event is to determine, one of the purposes is to determine which button was pressed, right? So let's use that to determine which button was pressed in a radio group. Okay, so for that I'm going to do event dot get param. Okay, I'm getting the parameter from that event, and the name of the parameter is going to be value. Okay, because we know that the radio group has a parameter called value embedded in it, and that is what I'm going to capture in my in a JavaScript variable. Let me call it um, changed value. Okay, so whatever we've selected is captured in that changed value, and now what we should do, um, we should do a component dot set. What are we setting? There is remember that there is that selected display option attribute that we've defined, and let us set v dot selected display option with what? With the value that the user has clicked, the one that we have just changed to. We switched to this changed value, so the selected display option should change accordingly. And for clarity, let me do a console.log and let me print the changed value so we could see. You have just clicked on, okay, and see what happens. Okay, um, now let's go here, refresh the page, and table. Actually, let's look at the logs, developer tools. Oh, there. So it is working. Let me clear that. And table and cards. So I click on table, it populates table. I click on cards, it says cards. Oh, so the last piece to the puzzle would be to actually toggle between the two components that we have on the UI. Notice if we go back to accounts, we have the radio button logic in place, with display options and selected display option, and with a lightning radio group, right? But notice that we have commented our two components here. Now what I'm going to do is use an if condition. Okay, and the way you do if is by doing aura if, okay, is true, like so. Okay, and this is the condition that when that is evaluated to true is when you enter the if block. Okay, in here, what is my condition? Condition is going to be if v dot selected display option, okay, if it is equal to cards, okay, like that. If your selected display option equals cards, then I want to show this component. Okay. And then there is no aura else specifically, but the way you handle else is within aura if. That is, you do aura set, okay, and then attribute is gonna be else. Okay, so aura if has an attribute called else implicitly, and you use the aura set command to set that attribute. Okay, so if you're in the else block, then display the records in a data table format. Okay, let me clear that white space out. Okay, save it. All right, so if selected display option is cards, show cards. Otherwise, show account table uh, by passing in the same records. Okay, refresh. All right, so by default, it's card layout. Okay, and then table. There, it switches because you just clicked on table and then cards. I clicked on cards and then there they are. All right, let me close my um, browser logs and there, and then nicely displayed card layout versus a table layout. Good. Now, I would like to pause here or stop here for this video, but an exercise for you would be based on the hello X component that we created, based on the account info component that we created, and based on what we just saw in this video, a toggle between a list of accounts versus a data table in card versus data table formats. Based on these three videos that we have so far, what I would like you to implement as an exercise, if you're doing this hands-on as you're watching the video, is implement a lightning input, a text box here, and then a button by it called search. When a user enters a value, any text, and clicks on that search button, or maybe even on key up, like when they start typing in, automatically this list needs to be searched and it needs to be refreshed with, and it needs to display the results that match the specific criteria. Say pick a name, perhaps a name. So pass in United, and you should see these two records and not Gene Point, because that does not have the word United in its name, right? So implement a search functionality. That would be a good exercise for you at this point. All right.